Hey, welcome everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started so that we have enough time. Really thrilled to have you all here today for our Implementation Science Initiative seminar series that this year is really focused a lot on issues of health equity. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Gina Wingood join us to talk about the ADAPT-IT framework, really focused on enhancing the cultural relevancy, reach, and efficacy of evidence-based interventions. So, Dr. Wingood is the Sidney and Helene Lerner Professor of Public Health Promotion. She's a professor in the Department of Social Medical Sciences, and she's also the director of the Lerner Center for Public Health Promotion and the director of a T32 on social determinants of HIV at Mailman School of Public Health. She received her doctorate from Harvard School of Public Health, and she's been the PI of over 25 NIH funded grants. She's published over 400 peer reviewed articles, including in JAMA and Pediatrics and AJPH. She's been invited to the White House for her expertise in the context of HIV prevention interventions for African Americans and received numerous awards, including the Ryan White Distinguished Leadership Award. And she's been just a fabulous mentor for me as well in social medical sciences. So I'm really thrilled to have her join us today to share her expertise. And I will hand things over to you, Gina. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and really thank you for all of you. The implementation science work here is really just amazing at CUIMC, and thanks for all your leadership with part of that, and it's an honor to be invited, so thank you so much. As Rachel mentioned, I'm going to be talking about ADAPT-IT and ADAPT-IT frameworks, and I'm a pretty casual presenter. Feel free to ask me questions at the end, and we'll talk about that. And I'll be using the term EBIS, EBIS, quite often throughout my presentation. So if you see this, it just means evidence-based interventions. And I'll really be talking about sort of adapting evidence-based interventions. So what is adaptation and adapting anyway? Adaptation is really sort of making modifications to an existing evidence-based intervention or EBI to enhance fit for a particular population and or context. And these modifications might be additions, maybe the intervention content. They might be deletions to maybe remove outdated materials, or even substitutions of materials or intervention facilitators. So why do we actually engage? What's the rationale for actually adapting an evidence-based intervention? Well, typically what we want to do is have a balance, okay? What we really want to do is make our sort of new intervention compatible and really more acceptable with our new population and community's goals. However, we want to maintain the original core components as prescribed in the protocol of the original EBI. And so when I mention core components, what am I talking about? Core elements or core components, these are sort of the components that represent the mechanisms of change of an EBI, or that also produce the effectiveness of the evidence-based intervention. Common core elements include the content of the intervention, maybe the theory or the manual or the role plays, or it could include the setting where the intervention was conducted, maybe it was a school or a health department, or maybe the format of the intervention, sometimes it's a video intervention or a face-to-face intervention, or even how the intervention is facilitated, either by a peer educator or more of a PhD-led individual. These are often common sort of elements or core elements of an evidence-based intervention. So while there's many pluses to actually adapting interventions, there are some challenges as well. So the pros of adapting an EBI include sort of enhancing sort of greater fit for your new population. And this really sort of allows for ownership of, not really for scientists, but the agency of the community that's actually adapting the intervention. It really enhances feasibility and acceptability for the community, and you're involving your community and other team members. Of course, there are challenges. Probably the biggest one is taking an intervention of known efficacy and really sort of making modifications or changing it potentially to an intervention with unknown efficacy. That's one of the biggest sort of challenges or concerns. Also, it's exciting to involve team members, but this can be costly and it can be timely as well. The most common type of program adaptation is actually adapting programs or EBIs to enhance their cultural relevancy. And this is so important because without attention to cultural relevancy, you've adapted intervention, which remains faithful to the core elements, but it really lacks relevancy, sustainability, and most importantly, acceptability for your new population. Honestly, there's a multitude of adaptation frameworks. A couple of years ago, a scientist looked at sort of what were sort of the common adaptation frameworks out there, and she found about 20 of the top most popular. The adaptive framework, which myself and my colleagues developed, is probably one of the third most common adaptation frameworks out there. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, most of these adaptation frameworks, they really encourage you sort of identifying evidence-based interventions. And often these are located as part of the CDC or of SAMHSA. They're published often in journal articles. I know the NCI, they have a whole program on sort of research-tested intervention programs. And so many adaptation frameworks, whether it's adapted or other evidence-based adaptation frameworks, often suggest that you use sort of evidence-based interventions found through these sort of federal programs. The adaptive framework includes 8 steps, and I'll go through these 8 steps, but I'll also share with you a couple of case studies actually applying the adaptive framework. So what is the first step? Well, the first step is called assessment. Okay, so adapted is basically an acronym, and each letter in the acronym is sort of a step. And this first step is assessment. So when you're adapting an evidence-based intervention, who are you adapting it for? Who is this new population? What makes them vulnerable? So if the original evidence-based intervention was developed for women, who's your new population? Is it teens? Is it families? Is it rural populations? Who are you adapting your new evidence-based program for? And then, as I mentioned earlier, there tend to be many evidence-based interventions. And so part of the challenge when actually thinking of which intervention to actually use is which intervention is most appropriate, which is the best fit for your population. And as I'll talk about in a little while, you usually have a team of people deciding which intervention, which EBI is most appropriate to actually adapt for your population. So I'm just going to share with you sort of one of my evidence-based interventions and just share with you how I've adapted this intervention for several populations. So one evidence-based intervention that I have is called Sista. Sista is an acronym. It stands for Sisters Informing Sisters About Topics on AIDS. The goal of Sista was to enhance safer sex. The population I recruited were African-American women in my community. And I worked with an agency, it was an African-American community-based organization. The actual Sista intervention included 5 group sessions, with each being about 2 hours in length. The content of these sessions was talked about ethnic and gender pride, sort of basics of HIV prevention and testing, communication skills, condom skills, as well as healthy relationship skills. The intervention was implemented by an African-American female health educator, and it was implemented as part of a face-to-face group setting. So this intervention was defined by CDC as an evidence-based intervention, and I'll go through that in a little bit. And CDC typically have these sort of tiers of interventions, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And tier 1 means it was sort of the most rigorous evaluated intervention type. This particular intervention was published in JAMA. It was the first intervention to enhance consistent condom use for African-American women, thereby reducing their risk of HIV and other STIs. This intervention, CDC defined, was a social movement because of the widespread dissemination of this particular HIV intervention, this particular EBI. So because it was widely being disseminated by CDC, I developed not just the actual evidence-based intervention, but also the Sista dissemination package. And so when I say dissemination package, what does that really mean? Often when you look at EBIs, you see them maybe published in journals, and you want to sort of replicate that or adapt that, but you don't really have enough information because a journal only provides so much information. So I created this dissemination package, which also includes other components. These include just sort of a one-page overview of the Sista intervention, the logic model. I'll outline the core elements. It included a budget. How much might a facilitator cost? How much might the materials cost? I had implementation worksheets. Also, if communities want to adapt the intervention, I would have the adaptation protocol. And I also included all the evaluation instruments that I used. So it was really a package that I sent around. So for example, CDC disseminated this one intervention widely across the US. I'll just take one state, for example, I'm looking at Texas. And in Texas, the CDC trained almost 300 people to implement Sista. By now, Sista has been implemented in all states across the US. However, it was just sort of trained for a 2-year period, 300 people were trained in Sista. And consequently, of course, in terms of number of organizations, just over a 2-year period from 2010 to 2012, again, just looking at Texas, over 100 organizations in Texas were trained in the Sista EBI. Okay. And so, of course, many states, many facilities want to change Sista or adapt it to fit their needs and their relevance and their community. And also, this has been disseminated globally in Spain, South Africa, the Caribbean, just numerous places globally as well. And there's been many, many, many adaptations of Sista, okay? It's been adapted for Japanese women, for faith-based populations, for transgender women, we call it Twista. There's been lots and lots of adaptations. And it's important to note, while I was involved in the original development and design of Sista, I was not really just developed in many of these other adaptations. So these are more community-led adaptations. Okay. So people often ask, well, what can be adapted as part of the adaptation protocol? And there's really a continuum for adaptation. What red light adaptations are sort of adaptations that really should be avoided because you want to maintain fidelity to the core elements. And so you don't want to sort of change or modify any of the core elements. Yellow light adaptations can be made, but they should be made cautiously. And green light adaptations are actually safe to make. Let's look a little bit closely at sort of green light, yellow light, and red light adaptations. So green light adaptations are really sort of the adaptations to enhance sort of reach and receptivity of your interventions. This including sort of customizing many of the program materials, maybe changing the name, changing pictures, changing words, changing the language, maybe from English to Spanish, or even changing the way you recruit your population, maybe from active recruitment to a more passive recruitment. These are, again, sort of more easier adaptations that can be made to your intervention programs. Yellow-light adaptations can be made, but they should be really made with caution. Examples of these include maybe the length or order of program activities. If you want to actually add vignettes to actually address other risk factors that might be more pertinent to your new population, such as addressing alcohol use. If you want to include more contextual factors such as parental influences, if you want to actually apply your EBI to a different population, or change the setting in which the EBI was actually implemented or delivery format, these can all be done, but they're more what we call yellow-light adaptations. So just please sort of use caution when adapting EBIs to these contexts. Red light adaptations are adaptations that we don't suggest because what they involve typically are sort of changing the underlying theory or mechanisms of change. Examples of these are when you change the health outcome of your EBI, or even when you actually sort of delete a lot of content or the core elements, when you drastically reduce the duration from like 60 minutes to 20 minutes, or when you drastically reduce those from like 6 sessions to like 1 or 2 sessions. So how is adaptation? How does actually it happen? Okay, this is sort of production. This involves what we call an adaptation team. The adaptation team can include stakeholders, people who work with your new population, and of course, members of the new population themselves. The ADAPT team helps you brainstorm sort of what is adapted, how it's adapted, and how the adaptations, most importantly, can enhance reach, receptivity, and relevance. The adaptation team is key in producing your newly adapted intervention. So how does the adaptation physically actually occur? It occurs by not just using your adaptation team, but it also occurs via a new method called theater testing. And so what is theater testing? Theater testing involves sort of a couple of things, okay? Number one, it involves your participants, but also it involves your adaptation team. So just if you take a look at this picture, just pretend your participants are in the middle of this circle here, and your adaptation team is on the outer circle. So the inner circle involves sort of the new participants. And what they do is they may observe the facilitator implementing core elements of the EVI. And what they're going to do, they're going to suggest modifications to the original EVI. Okay. Those individuals on the outer circle, the adaptation team, their main goal is to listen first, listen really to the individuals in the inner circle, what your reflective of the new population is suggesting, and then they can provide also sort of other suggestions. Theater testing is very active. So it's unlike maybe a focus group where you're sort of providing information. Because you're actually implementing often sort of elements, core elements of your intervention, you're actually doing the intervention, you're implementing the intervention. And your participants are sort of saying, you know what, let's frame the intervention sort of vignettes in a different way to make them more relevant for our population. You may have a video-based intervention. So what the adaptation team is looking at, what the participants are looking at, are maybe video clips of your video-based intervention. And if they're doing that, they're making suggestions to your video-based intervention. So it's really a critical look at your intervention in terms of making suggestions. In addition, your adaptation team also includes what we call topic experts. And these may be a range of individuals. They may be academics, they may be individuals from the community, health department officials, if you're doing church work, maybe they're pastors. If you're doing work in sort of criminal justice activities, they may include probation officers. They include a wide range of individuals. They're basically very knowledgeable about the content of your intervention, and their involvement is really designed to enhance the efficacy of your adapted intervention. Adaptation is a really iterative process. And so what you're doing is sort of integrating the suggestions and feedback from your adaptation team and from this theater testing process to integrate adaptive material into the original EVI. Then of course you have to train your recruiters and your health educators to implement this newly adapted intervention. And then finally, you really want to sort of pilot test your adapted intervention. You may or may not do sort of a full-blown sort of randomized controlled trial, but you do want to do some testing, some pilot testing of your newly adapted intervention. Let's look at a couple of case studies of the adaptive process, okay? So like I said, the original evidence-based intervention system was an evidence-based intervention designed to enhance safer sex and reduce HIV risk among African-American women recruited from community-based settings. So this case study involves adapting Sista for Latinas, and this was called Amigas. So here we adapted the setting to the Miami-Dade Health Department clinics. The original setting was actually in community-based organizations. Of course, the recruiters here were Latina recruiters who spoke Spanish. The health educators were all Latina female health educators who implemented the 5 sessions of the original EVI. The recruitment materials were also much more culturally sensitive and more relevant to the program. And of course, the intervention content was also adapted. So let me just share with you examples of how the intervention content was adapted. So in the Sista intervention, we would ask questions such as this. What do you enjoy about being an African-American woman? How are African-American women negatively depicted in the media? And who are some of your African-American female role models? So as part of the adaptation process for the Amigas intervention for Latina women, we would ask questions about what do you enjoy about being a Latina woman? How are Latinas negatively depicted in the media? And who are some of your Latina role models? So we would just not sort of ask the questions, but also the materials would change as well. And the materials were really sort of selected by the community, the adaptation team from the community. When we said adapting evidence-based materials for how a Latina woman negatively depicted in the media, this is what they would show. When we talked about sort of depicting positive attributes and images of Latina women, this is another example. And this was my sort of co-adaptation team for Amigas. Like I said, it's a real team effort, and it includes health educators, recruiters, people who work with Latina population, just a whole team. And of course, we also included topic experts, and these were well-respected members from the Latina community, health department officials, as well as Latina scientists who conducted research with Latinas on HIV. And they really sort of enhanced further the efficacy of our intervention. They went through this iterative process of the adaptation framework. We trained and recruited Latina health educators, and we piloted the intervention. And this intervention was published in the American Journal of Public Health. And this is the first EBI actually for Latinas to enhance safer sex. Let me share with you another adaptation as well. This particular adaptation is taking Sista, which again was originally developed for African-American women recruited from community-based organizations. So another adaptation that we did was adapting Sista for predominantly Black churches, okay? And of course, Black churches are widely respected, sort of credible institutions in the African-American community and a tremendous source of support. So to facilitate this process, we actually recruited health educators from the church health ministry to adapt Sista. And of course, we also adapted the intervention content. So as I mentioned, just looking at the first session of Sista, we asked about the joys and challenges of being an African-American woman, role models who influence your life, and HIV risk reduction strategies. For faith-based Sista, what we looked at is the values of being an African-American Christian woman, the role of Christianity played in the African-American community, and in addition to talking about HIV, we also talked about abstinence. And of course, because we're working in churches, we could not bring condoms into the church. It's still a church, but we adapted what we could do. Historically, we talked about sort of communicating with sexual partners, but here we also talked about sort of linking activities and communicating with the HIV church ministry. We talked about healthy relationships in the original EBI. In the faith-based Sista, we talked about sort of developing healthy relationships with the church health ministry. So what we're doing is just adapting it to the setting. This intervention was also published in AJPH, and it was one of the first evidence-based interventions for faith-based, African-American faith-based settings. We thought this was an important step for faith-based settings, but we really wanted to go further. We realized that when working with sort of organizations such as faith-based settings, what we want to do is not just sort of change sort of the intervention content to be more reflective of working with faith-based interventions, but we also wanted to involve leaders, okay? And so we went a step further in this new thing that I'm talking to you about, is really adapting Sista to work with the faith-based leadership. So in doing this study, we actually worked with megachurches, okay? So we're adapting the setting, okay? And megachurches, by definition, includes over 2,000 sort of congregants or church members. So some people think megachurches are very, very, very common in the South, which they are. I was at Irving when I sort of first did the study in Atlanta, Georgia. But really, megachurches are really across the United States. They're in New York, they're all over the place. So as part of this adaptation to involve leadership, what we had, of course, is a recruitment team involving church leaders, but I also developed the recruitment video. And the recruitment video actually featured the women's ministry as well as female leaders in the church. I also developed the recruitment website. So again, what I'm trying to do is actually do a sort of more of an organizational adaptation as well, not just an adaptation of the intervention content, but also sort of how do we involve the organization itself, as well as the leadership. So again, I'm looking at not just individual level, but also more organizational level adaptations. And this is just one of the churches I worked with. It had beautiful sculptures in it, just in the church. It was just a fabulous church. So of course, many of these churches, many of these mega churches, which are actually quite loud, of course, the individual at the pulpit, the pastor has a very powerful position. So in terms of acting with the church leadership, one of the other adaptation activities was actually discussing HIV testing, not just in the curricula, but discussing HIV testing at the church pulpit. My topic experts here were pastors. I worked with female and male pastors. Had a great adaptation team, included really leadership of the actual church. In addition to the leadership of the church, what they also wanted from the adaptation team is a broader representation of African-American organizations to be part of this adaptation effort. And so in doing so, what I did is I worked with the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's really the largest and really sort of longest standing association working with African-American populations. I worked with Alicia Keys, her organization. I worked with Tyler Perry Studios. He's a famous producer and director and actor. I also worked with other faith church partners. Ebenezer Baptist Church, of course, is where Martin Luther King pastored. This is an older picture from the 60s and 70s. It's been revised and looks great and new. It's sort of the bottom picture here. I also worked with Balm and Gilead. It's a really sort of respected, well-known faith-based agency. So part of what I did, again, is not just sort of modify my intervention content, but I'm really looking at the organizational leadership of how I can actually sort of adapt Sista. So when we're working with leadership, they all sort of, many of the pastors really sort of view themselves as transformational leaders. And so a part of this more leadership intervention, I highlighted sort of the importance of transformational leadership for social justice. Because I really wanted more of an organizational change, we wanted something that was a really sort of a public commitment of HIV prevention and testing. So people would often sort of much more often wear ribbons as well. Let me just share with you some of the messages of the video that I shared with the leaders. And this message is, of course, from female faith leaders that I worked with to enhance sort of HIV testing and prevention, not just with the congregants, but really with the church leaders.
The budget does not dictate the work of the church. It really is about the leadership. And if that leader wants to make a change in the souls and the hearts and the minds of the community in which he has been called to serve.
The leaders were not just interested in sort of faith-based leadership, but they also wanted to see sort of political leaders who were supportive of HIV prevention, as well as HIV testing initiatives. So we also highlighted this video as well.
So one of the things that we're here in front of this van to do today is my wife and I are going to get tested for HIV/AIDS. Because if you know your status, then you can prevent illness. You can prevent passing it to your children and to your families, and we can make everybody have healthier, happier lives. So I just want everybody to remember that if a U.S. Senator from the United States can get tested and his wife can get tested, then everybody in this crowd can get tested.
Let's take 10 minutes to discuss your responses to the following questions. Could you take an HIV test today? Could you ask people in your church to get an HIV test? Can you talk about HIV testing in your sermons? And can you ask church leaders like yourself to take an HIV test and talk about HIV in their sermons? In this style of transformational leadership, we hope that you incorporate these steps in your church ministry and encourage others to do the same.
So what I'm trying to do is not just actually have the congregants sort of change their behavior to more receptive of HIV testing, but I also want to have that happen across the leadership of the church as well. So also my adaptation team really wanted to see something sort of more historical and sort of cultural leaders also represented as part of the sort of HIV leadership video.
There are currently 21,000 Black churches in the U.S. 53% of the Black community says they attend church weekly. This means the Black church has the ability to harness the power of 20 million parishioners to help deliver an AIDS-free generation. Now is our opportunity. We were called to serve. We have the power to help stop the HIV epidemic in our community. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We, the NAACP, have our armor on. Will you join the fight? Act now and visit www.theblackchurchandhiv.org. Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want.
And so part of what we're doing as well as when we're sort of framing these leaders is we're not really talking about HIV. That was not the main issue. What we wanted to do was really frame HIV as a social justice issue. And so we didn't say go around, oh, this is an HIV prevention intervention. We really framed it as a social justice program. And then again, it's really enhancing reach, relevance, and really receptivity of our intervention and adapting it as such. So again, as part of our sort of adaptive process, we would go through the adaptation. So the iterative process, we would train our health educators sort of to implement this newly adapted program. And of course, we pilot tested it. And this intervention was published a couple of years ago in AJPH, as it was a multi-level intervention with African American churches to enhance adoption of point-of-care HIV and diabetes testing. And this was really conducted with sort of these sort of church leadership interventions, and it was conducted with mega churches in the Atlanta area. Thank you very, very much for listening a little bit about adapting interventions.
Okay, that was amazing. I've heard you speak and in my class about adapted, and every time I learn something new. So the levels at which you've done this work are really, really amazing. So
thanks so much. Thank you.
So I'll open it up. We have about 20-25 minutes if people want to ask questions.
Thank you so much.
Gina, this is Susan Tross. I just want to I just want to say that you are really groundbreaking, and you have changed our field and continue to do so. And I don't have a question except how do you get to be you?
So these, when you do these sort of these video sessions, it's like, oh, this happened in like over a year or 2 years. And unfortunately, this was like a long time. You know, it takes years to work with. Community work is lovely, as we all probably know and work with, but it takes a long time to work with communities, it takes a long time to work with leaders, it takes a long time to work with organizations. It takes trust, it takes to just sort of keep on going at it. Of course, like I've had 100 churches say like, no, we don't want to sort of have HIV testing or HIV anything or condom discussions or anything, you know, involved in this. That was a lot of years of that. And so coming to this was really sort of a long time in coming. I don't want to pretend that, oh, this took a year or 2 years. That was a complete lie. And of course, it took like numerous NIH grants to do this as well, and CDC grants. So this is a compilation of work over time. And you know, I think implementation science is, as you all know, it's very, very, very exciting, but it's very timely. But I think you need to really make the investment. If you want to have it come out really good, you have to have that investment. And it's the joy of collaboration that we all sort of maintains our interest in doing this.
I had a couple of questions. That was extremely inspiring and amazing. I'm Natalie Moyes. How are you? How are you? So I guess one question, I guess 2 questions maybe. One I thought the theater testing was great, and that looks like something that I think many of us would want to infuse into our work. Do you have a sense for whether or not you're approaching this completely open-ended with no kind of suggestions for adaptations already, or do you already have a list just based on the literature, based on what you know of some potential either cultural tailoring or adaptations that you know you want to make, and you're trying to assess the kind of acceptability of those? That's one question. And then
that's a great question, Natalie. So what I'll do, sorry, I think I forget things way too easily, so I have to do one by one. I'm so sorry. So we do. So we review the literature, of course, and we say, okay, we know that these are key areas that we need to be adapted, and a lot of them are cultural. And when people say what's cultural, that's really what we're sort of working with when we work with our participants. You know we want to sort of adapt it to your culture, but what is that? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And so we do have an idea, but we want to get a little bit more specific, a little bit more granular, honestly, when we're doing it.
Okay, great. That's great. And then very much related is what is the outcome that you're looking for here? Is it that we're maximizing acceptability? Is it that we're maximizing feasibility? Is it that, and I think we do so much I do a lot of user testing, and I think we focus too much perhaps on the patients and not necessarily on the healthcare system or other things that we're trying to, so maybe this is different levels. You have a different outcome based on the level, potentially. Maybe the healthcare system, it's just about feasibility and costs. And maybe for the patients, it's all about, so do you have any kind of recommendations for either measures or outcomes that we think that, okay, I feel like I've now fully adapted this because I've either maximized acceptability or I've maximized a certain outcome, for example?
Those are great questions. And part of it depends on your community. So some communities have access to, like, I'll just say facilitators, right? And so maybe their adaptation process might not be at the facilitator level, but maybe time is an issue. So maybe they have to reduce it a little bit. Others might be, every community has a different need. So part of it is informed by the need of the community or by the need of the agency that you're working with. For others, it's actually, we have to, we have a Latina population. It was great that it was done by, with African Americans. How do we change it culturally? So it really depends on the agency and sort of their need. They're sort of driving it, which is why you need them heavily involved in the process. So sometimes it's fit, sometimes it's relevance. Fit is a 3-letter word that has enormous meanings and very diverse meanings for every agency. It's really hard to say, what does it mean for you? So the community has to sort of share that with us in terms of the process of it.
So helpful, thank you.
Thanks.
And I know, Gila, you had your hand up. I don't know if you're still here, if you wanted to unmute and ask, but I think your hand's down now. But I didn't want to.
Yeah, no, it's less about, I guess, adaptability and the long term, but knowing the need for vaccination now, do you think there is a way to rapidly adapt to things, or it's always a very long-term thing?
That's a great question, knowing the need for vaccinations. And there are a lot of church organizations and other organizations really becoming involved in sort of adapting sort of vaccination programs to African American and other diverse populations. And a lot of HBCUs are involved as well. And the good thing is many organizations are involved. Again, it's a long-term process. I put it in these few little steps, but these steps take a while to do. And that's whether you're developing a new intervention or adapting an existing intervention, it still is a process. And just working sort of smartly through that process and collaboratively is part of what we have to do.
It looks like May has a question too, which I think fits in a little bit with Natalie's speaking about the process you undertake in choosing the EBI to adapt. So I don't know if you want to say anything else about that in particular.
May? I'm sorry. So that's a great question. So when you go to these, CDC or SAMHSA or, NCI, whatever, they often have like many evidence-based interventions. And you're like, so which one do I pick? And, some are tailored to populations already. Some are face-to-face, some are group, some are video-based. And part of that decision is really involves your team, okay? And everybody has a different take on what they think is going to work best for their population. And that's why it's such a team-oriented activity. So like I said, the beauty of adaptation is that it involves the team. The challenge is that when you work with teams, sometimes everybody has their own opinion. And it's working through that to decide, what is our priorities within this adaptation process. It's that sort of prioritizing of decision-making that really sort of determines which EBI is selected or which EBI is most appropriate for you. And honestly, some people sort of combine EBIs. They do all these sort of interesting things with EBI. And sometimes an EBI is available and you can see where it's published, but you have no idea what the core elements are. You have no idea of how much it would take to actually implement the EBI. And so it looks good on paper, but there's no information about it. And so it's really sort of a process of selecting which EBI sort of makes the most sense, which do you know the most about, which is your community sort of most relevant. It's not like a one-step question. It's really a process. It's adapting is sort of digging in deep and sort of weighing a little bit through the exciting mud of what we enjoy doing. It's getting dirty, it's the action of sort of public health, which to me is exciting, but you just have to sort of engage and collaborate and engage in it.
Thanks, Gina. And it looks like Susie Hoffman has a great question about, I wonder how we know if the adapted intervention still includes the core elements and it's still effective. And I get this question a lot about, like, if we're making adaptations, do we have to go back and test it, and how much adaptation requires retesting? So
yeah, great question. Excellent question, Susie. So of course, because some of us or many of us are NIH funded, they want to see, like, Gina, do you have an RCT to prove that your adaptation actually was effective? Hi, Susie. So we actually sort of tend to do these RCT sort of evaluations, but many CBOs we realize don't have the resources or skills or whatever to do that. And so we do suggest pilot testing. Like I said, there's been many adaptations. And so we don't know. We hope that some of the core elements are made. And really the whole reason why this came about is because as CDC was unrolling or disseminating my evidence-based interventions, I would say, well, how do you know if, like, Sista is really relevant for Latina populations and Native populations in these areas? I'm sure they're adapting them. And I would ask CDC, how do you know if they're, like, maintaining the core elements or what they're doing? And they said, that's a great question, Gina. We have no idea what they're doing. And so ADAPT-IT really came about to provide some sort of structure, some method to actually sort of help with that process. I'm not saying it solves all the answers of, are they maintaining still the core elements? Do we know if it's exactly effective? And sometimes and often we don't, but at least there's a methodology for actually going about what we could do to enhance its efficacy and to maintain its core elements. It's a great question.
Could I do a little add-on to that?
Oh, please, yes.
You know, the intervention for the churches is really phenomenal. But if somebody on the outside were doing that, would you have said that they had maintained the core elements, that they were really adapting Sista? I mean, in a way, to me, it seems more like a new intervention than it does an adaptation. So I wonder how you, since you did it yourself, how you think about that.
Yes, we went from Sista, then we went to faith-based Sista, then we did the leadership intervention. So it's sort of like this evolving adaptation, you know, and originally, you know, CDC said, no, that's just an adaptation. I'm like, isn't it? And, you know, honestly, those terms, new intervention, adapted intervention, oh, that's a continuum of terminology as well. And as you go on through the years, the terms change, and it's the beauty of public health being involving in new fields. I wish, you know, that the terminology changes, but you're right. You're absolutely correct.
Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Susie.
I have another question about the theater. Do you have participants who don't feel comfortable having people sitting around them and looking at them?
So actually, before they're selected, we definitely share with them what the theater test is. And so we share with them, there's going to be stakeholders there, there's going to be people in the community there. There'll be, we don't say them, but, you know, PIs there, we don't say PIs, but, you know, other scientists there who also be working. But their main job is to listen. They're going to listen to you first. And so part of it is really explaining that whole process. And honestly, the participants are the most vocal in these theater testing. And it's really interesting to see the people around them, they tend to honestly agree with many of the suggestions that are made. So there's a lot of agreement with the suggestions, but they're fully informed before coming into this process of what's happening. And I think originally when people were adapting interventions, they would do focus groups. And I'd be like, well, what does that tell me about how to actually adapt the actual sessions or the vignettes? It just wasn't informative to me, unfortunately. And so I said, I really need to have a more active process in terms of this. And so this theater testing really was an active process featuring, really highlighting the participants, but I did not want to lose the stakeholders. And I think that's a really important component, that they're both involved, and they're both involved at the same time, so they can actually listen to one another.
Thanks, Gina. It looks like Kate has a really related question, Kate Lavera, on how you resolve differing perspectives in the inner circle and adaptation. So for example, if church leaders versus congregants have differing opinions.
Great idea, great question. And that's part of it. You know, it's like, okay, not everybody is going to agree. And I call it iterative. It's a nice little term to say we sort of, it's like any decision-making process. People have different ideas of what is a priority. And so part of this iterative process is saying, you know what, I think this was heard most loudly and most consistently. It's really listening and sort of saying, you know, I think this is really what is really needs, just culturally, this is the best fit. It's sort of like you have to go with the fit, this little 3-letter fit word again. And this is really what's going to enhance sort of its activity. And so we even do the theater testing a couple of times. It's not like a one-time thing to actually see. It's really this sort of iterative decision-making process.
Thank you.
You know, we love teamwork. We love the muddy of it. it's that process of it.
And then, so you have the different types of stakeholders together. Do you find that they learn from each other while they're talking? Because again, I can imagine the church leaders and the congregants thing was what made me think, like, I bet they kind of have a different perspective on how things actually are.
They do. And sometimes, so for example, the congregants are like, why can't we have condoms in the church? And the church leaders are like, that is not happening, okay? There are no condoms in the church. And so what is a sort of a intermediary step, we said, what happens if we can mail the congregants sort of condoms? And that was sort of like an intermediate step. So you're able to mail them. And so it's really sort of like, you know, if you have families, it's like when you have conversations, you know, it's sort of like, okay, if I give here, will you give here? It's that process, you know, and I think we don't often see that process in science, or maybe we do, and we like agree to disagree. It's that sort of, okay, I'm going to do this. If you do this, it's sort of like, It's that delicateness of decision making, which is why I say it takes a little longer. So it's not simply, me sitting or someone, a health educator sitting at their desk sort of changing material. It's really a much more informed, collaborative process, which is why it does take a little bit more time. But I think the final product is really a product that we've all sort of come together on. It's really a well-informed product.
Looks like Jessica has a question, and then we'll go to Philip and Dita as well. So Jessica, I think I know where this question is coming from. Jessica says, what if you go through the adaptive process and then realize that the EBI selected may not be a good fit for the population? And if so, how do you resolve this?
Wow, it's hard to actually show that at the very, 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 very end. They usually sense that a little bit earlier in the adaptation process because it is so iterative and because it is so investment oriented. They tend to sort of realize that a little bit up front. And part of it, it's a little bit about decision making. It's like, you know what? If it doesn't feel right, it probably is not right. And it's not sometimes you can't correct things just by going further and further down. You have to sort of say, you know what? This is not working. It's not right. It's not relevant. It's not really going to be acceptable. We either have to get a different EBI or do something differently.
Philip, do you want to go?
Yeah. Hi, Gina. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. It's actually comes well after this last question. So something I've had once with my K, which I'm so grateful for you to, I've used Adapted extensively. But one of the reviewer comments, and then I've gotten this again in a subsequent NIH submission, is that a weakness is that the later stages are dependent on the earlier stages, phrase something like that, right? So how do you like in terms of grantsmanship and also practice, how do you deal with that?
So the later stages, so once it's adapted, right? Once it's after the adapted process, is that what you're?
Well, they're sort of like adapted, like the 8 phases. And so they might say, look, I think the critique is like, what if you have a problem at phase 3 and you can't go to phase 4 or something like that, that there's this idea that if you don't follow through, then you can't complete the what you proposed in the grant, that there's sort of a weakness there. And I wonder.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's actually iterative. So it's there are steps, but it's sort of iterative within those. So if you find that something is not working, you have to sort of go back. It's iterative as well. So it's stepwise, but it's also iterative. So it's that iterative piece that actually says, you know what, maybe we need to do sort of A, B, or C, whatever it was, and maybe revisit that again. So it is stepwise, but it's also iterative as well. Yeah.
Nandita, did you want to go?
Thanks.
Hi, this is Nandita Sugandhi. I'm with ICAP at the Bronx Prevention Center.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a really, really fantastic talk. And you gave me a lot of ideas. But one of the things you mentioned earlier is sort of kind of the need for evidence and kind of looking at RCTs and the relationship. And I'm just curious if you could say something more, because that's what I am, supposed to do. And at the same time, I find that we're missing something here. And the approach that you're sharing is like, oh, I could see how you could bring that concept in to make it more useful. But at the same time, if you go to the CDC or the NIH, I'm just curious how that works. I would love for you to say something more about that.
Yeah, so the reliance on EBIs, is that what it is?
Well, the reliance on where did your evidence come from? What proof do you have? And then once you adapt that, then how you then say, let's now do another RCT, like sort of, how do you validate, I guess, or have you ever had that experience of you've started with an evidence-based intervention, you've then adapted it, and is there a like a validation process that sort of, you can then sort of say, okay, this is,
so
that makes sense of it.
I think so, yeah, the validation, I understand. So if you're submitting to like a federal agency like NIH or CDC, the validation tends to be, so how I validated my research is I conduct a RCT, and I tend to want to see sort of changes in behavior or changes in, because I deal with like HIV testing or reduce STI incidence, I want to see reductions in STI incidence. So to me, validation is either behavior change or change in sort of biological outcomes as a result of implementing a rigorous RCT. That typically is how validation occurs when I do my research. As I mentioned, for many of these CBOs or agencies that are sort of doing it, they may not need that validation. So validation really determines on sort of who's the reviewer, the subsequent reviewer. If it's NIH or CDC, you might need some hardcore sort of validation compared if it's the validations required for other agencies.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes left. Looks like in the chat we have a couple more questions. So Patricia asked about application of adapted in other fields. If you might, she said her work focuses on school-based EBIs.
So I also adapted, oh my gosh, it's been used for a lot of things. So actually, I just got off a call a couple of days ago. They're using adapted for actually dating violence intervention programs. We're also using adapted for different organizations. So right now I'm working with the US Army to actually apply adapted. So we're working with adapted for a different, my work is in the area of HIV, but it's been used with a number of other health conditions, health goals, and also with a number of other agencies as well. So it's very widely applicable.
And maybe one last question from Carol. She asked if the end the epidemic movement has been seen as an encouragement or a disincentive to modify messages.
Oh, that's a good question. So in the epidemic movement in the area of HIV, really they're less honestly focused on sort of these individual level EBIs, but yet it's fascinating because I see like at the last, I think March, sort of Women and Girls HIV Day, they featured like all my EBIs. I'm like, wait, I thought you were ending the epidemic. But yet, so I see sort of mixed messages from the ending the HIV epidemic movement. I think they do want to sort of encourage them, but also on a whole, they're also sort of focusing on sort of biomedical interventions, which is focusing less on these behavioral interventions. So I see sort of both pictures going on.
We are just at the hour. This has been so phenomenal. And I think that there might be additional questions, but maybe they'll follow up with you separately. But again, thank you for your time and your expertise. And we've recorded this, so I'm sure there will be people that will want to rewatch it again to learn from you. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.